Hey, and welcome back to the Photogs channel. And I'd like to talk a little bit to build on the last video when it came to f-stop and aperture AV mode and A mode in some cameras. What's kind of the next half of that? And that really is shutter speed. So shutter speed determines the exact moment that your camera captures that image, how the duration that the light is allowed to touch your sensor or your film in the case of these three cameras I have in front of me today. Now the nice thing is it doesn't matter whether you're relating to film or whether you're talking about digital. These two things are constant: f-stop, shutter speed. That's going to be something you need to control regardless of whether you're shooting with film or digital. But there are some very subtle differences between the two, and I'm going to touch on that today in this video as well. So let's get started. So a fast shutter speed will suspend movement. It'll also create the idea of movement if you drag your shutter. What drag the shutter means is you use a slower shutter speed so actually your subject intentionally blurs. And a lot of times too, I will use that as kind of an advantage to creating kind of a moody look within photos. So it can be used in lots of different ways to kind of create a artistic kind of flair to your images. So with f-stop and shutter speed, they have to be in balance based on that balancing point being your ISO setting. So for example, if you're using ISO 400 speed film, that's your balancing point that the two variables of shutter speed and f-stop are balancing on top of, okay? So one of the advantages to a digital camera is that balancing point of ISO, or your sensitivity level, is honestly almost unlimited. Because a digital camera can see in far lower light than the human eye can see for sure. With film, there is a limit point of what film can capture as far as ISO. Really the highest speed film you can get today, really easily that is the T-Max 3200 speed film by Kodak. And that film was routinely pushed to 6400 ISO. Some people pushed it beyond that. I never pushed it beyond 6400 because I felt it was just too much grain at that point. But that's a call based on your creativity and what you're trying to portray in an image. But that's where we're at. So ISO is the balancing point of where f-stop and shutter speed lie. So if shutter speed is the most important variable in your photograph, for example, children running, sports, or high fast moving images you need to try and suspend that movement or freeze it, that's when shutter speed is really going to come in handy. But for example, what I really like to do for some wedding pictures, especially during the first dance between the subjects, the husband and wife, I would sometimes drag the shutter just a little bit, sometimes down to like a 1/15 of a second, depending on how quick they were dancing, to kind of create kind of a creative blur to the subject. Now when I did that, I usually, it depends on the situation how you're using it, but it can have some really cool looks to it and how the image turns out. But let's talk about how that works. So for the most part, in the world of film photography, one of the things you need to watch with your shutter speed was how you can hand hold it, because most film cameras do not have, they sure as heck don't have IBIS, and there aren't too many image stabilized lenses out there other than Canon at that time. So if you're talking about vintage cameras or older equipment like this Hasselblad here, there's no image stabilizer. The only image stabilizer that you had in the years of Hasselblad was a tripod, and that's all you got. So, you kind of have to balance that. So let's use the Hasselblad as an example here. So with hand holding a film camera at slower shutter speeds, there is a point of diminishing return. You can only hold it so long still without your own heartbeat kicking it off, where it's not going to work very well. Now part of that is depending on your lens you're using. So one of the rules we always follow in photography is your shutter speed shouldn't be any more than the reciprocal of the focal length. So let's say if you have a 60mm lens, you shouldn't be any slower than 60th of a second. And that reigns true with the old, when you're shooting film, especially with no image stabilizer, no IBIS, no nothing, you're on your own. So what I've found for me, and same thing, your mileage may vary, what I like to do is I like to always start at a 60th of a second. So even when I would go up to lenses like an 85mm, so 85mm, 50mm, 28mm, 18mm, those ranges, I usually try to keep it at 60. If I was in a pinch, I'd drop it down to 30. As long as my subjects aren't moving, if I want it rock solid. Those were kind of my points where it was like, yeah, I really don't want to drop it under 30. Because what I noticed is if I did shoot it at 30th of a second, handheld with like a 60mm lens on the Hasselblad, because also this is a heavy camera, that's about as much as I could do. And same thing, you may have to experiment a little bit to see what works best for you, but that's what I found worked best for me. Is 60th of a second was kind of that's the goal, that's the slowest I could handhold. Any slower than that, yeah, I really need to take a serious look at and see if I could, put in a faster film, or I had other possibilities. Now the nice thing is with film, one of the first things I do is just add light to the scene, put on a flash, put my subject in a place where the light was brighter so I could use a faster shutter speed. And sometimes I had that ability. Not all the time, but sometimes. But that's what I would do. 30th of a second handheld, 30th, let me repeat. 30th of a second was pushing it. That was like, okay, that's about as much as I was comfortable with. But for the most part, I wanted to have it at 60 at the slowest. Now, there's an exception to that. Of course, there always is with photography. So with 35mm cameras being smaller, lighter, more compact, I was a lot more comfortable shooting slow speeds with this. So when I was trying to blur motion or create, moving subjects, create kind of a motion cast, I was very comfortable shooting these down to 15th of a second. Same thing, depending on the lens a little bit. I wouldn't try it with a 200mm telephoto. Yeah, it's not gonna happen all that great. It just won't work well. But, for example, on my Canon system, this is not the Canon I used, but on this Canon camera, for example, when I shot Canon, I had one lens that was a 300mm 2.8 lens, which my dad adopted, and now he has that in his camera bag. But with that camera, it had an image stabilizer in it. And so even though it was a 300mm and very heavy, I could shoot that down to a 30th of a second. So there are little exceptions to the rule there, but most of those exceptions were governed by technology. So give it a try, play around with it a little bit, okay? So if you're trying to photograph a subject and intentionally blur them, you do need to experiment a little bit, and you might want to just experiment with a digital camera first so you don't waste film, because film is very expensive right now. But what I would do is with my film camera, let's say on this 50mm 1.4 lens, I would set the f-stop, depending on what was going on in the situation. But if I'm trying to blur motion, I usually want a little more depth of field, so that way if the subject didn't move out of focus, for example. So what I would do is turn my time value mode on, TV mode. Now on like Nikon cameras, it was S for shutter speed priority, but on the Pentax and Canon cameras, it was TV mode. And that stands for time value. And so I would just dial this to where I wanted it. So in this case, let's say if I wanted to really blur motion, I would shoot it at a 15th of a second or a 10th of a second. Bring it in. Still hold as still as I could physically. So I'm still bracing myself. Oh, quick pro tip. When you're shooting a camera, there are a couple things you can do in bracing your elbows and arms to give you more stable shots. So one of the things you want to do, keep your elbows in, keep them pinned to your body, and then press your viewfinder here. Press that viewfinder against your forehead a little bit, And that gives you 3 points of stabilization. So that way, it's really good and solid and you're not bouncing around. If you're doing this, yeah, you're not able to hold it as steady. So elbows in, pull it to your forehead, hold it close, take a deep breath, let out the breath halfway. So you just go. So, and it can make a difference. You'd be surprised at how much, if you're paying attention to your breath, can actually make a difference. So just something to try. So in that case, that's another thing. Also, when holding a camera, now, and a lot of times you have a grip, so you can keep, same thing. Because my hand is here, it's a good solid hold, so I can hold it really steady, okay? But if you don't have a grip or don't have a vertically oriented shutter button, and you're doing this way, and same thing, it's about a comfort thing. Some people are comfortable with different ways, but what I suggest, have your your right hand or your shutter hand on top, put the lens in the crook of your thumb and index finger like so, and hold it in and shoot. When I see people shoot like this, look at the way your wrist is. This is a very weak position. And then look, you're holding it up here, but there's nothing really bracing it. There's a lot more vibration. And if you look through the viewfinder, you'll notice it's a lot harder to hold the camera steady this way because your arm and your wrist and your hand are in a weakened position. It's not great. This is better ergonomics? Yeah, you'll have to correct me on pronunciation on that one. But this is far more stable this way. Same thing, or this, still better, I feel. But same thing, just personal opinion, but what I find is that holding it this way is a lot more stable. So there's your quick pro tip on holding a camera. Anyway, let's go on to the next part. Okay, one of the other things I want to talk about, now we've kind of touched on shutter speed, is of course, and I did also touch on as well, the balancing point. The balancing point being ISO. So ISO is basically set by the International Standards Organization, and it's basically creating a standard number or rating for a film or sensor's light sensitivity rating, so how sensitive it is to light. Of course, just like a digital camera, film's quality varies based upon the ISO of the film. So one of the things to keep in mind is the higher the ISO of your film, the grainier the photo is going to appear. Especially when you're talking about 35 millimeter cameras. Because a 35 millimeter camera is a smaller negative, it takes a higher magnification ratio to blow it up to, let's say, an 11 by 14 image. Typically in the days of film, even with really nice films like Portra 160 or Fuji's 160 speed film, which was called NPS, I think it was called NPS. Those were very fine-grained 35 millimeter films. But if you took a medium format camera, like a 120 film, format, this, even though the film was bigger, you could get almost the same or even a better grain structure with even 400 speed film. Because to blow up a photo to like an 11 by 14, you didn't have to blow it up quite as much. So because of that, the grain didn't appear as large as it would in a 35 millimeter camera. So that was one of the main reasons professional level portrait and wedding photographers would use a medium format camera like a Hasselblad. Or in some cases there would be kind of a hybrid mix. What I used to do for wedding photography and for portraits in my studio, for example, for the portraits, so the pictures of the bride by herself, the groom by himself, the group family photos where you have the whole family down to small groups of 4 to 5 people. For those shots, I always used my Hasselblad, my medium format camera. The reason why is because in wedding photography at that era, it was more likely that the bride was going to, or groom, the family, was going to enlarge pictures of the family groups. Those were pretty typical. So you wanted the finest grain, you wanted the highest quality possible, because those were most likely going to end up in people's photo albums or on the wall of their homes. So I always use 120 format for that. Now for the reception photos, the first dance, the cutting of the cake, during the wedding ceremony itself, like the bride, at the altar or walking down the aisle, for those shots, I always did 35 millimeter film because number one, it was less expensive than shooting medium format, and I knew that those pictures typically were not going to be blown up anything beyond like a 5x7 or 8x10. So for that, 35 millimeter film was fine for that, and there was no big deal. But as film grains became finer, more detailed, and better quality, then I could actually end up shooting an entire wedding with 35 millimeter cameras, and then it was no problem at all because the films had gotten so good towards the end of my wedding photography career per se. So, it was a trade-off. In fact, for a while too, there was the other benefit of, I even did a total swap from there where I used 35 millimeter film for the portraits of the bride and the groom and all that, just like I do with 120, and I used digital for the reception photos and for the first dance and when the bride was walking down the aisle, because at that point you're talking about cameras that were like 6 or 8 megapixel. So they weren't great big. So if you took a 6 or 8 megapixel camera of that era and blew it up to 8x10, that's about as good as it was going to get sometimes. It wasn't terrific. It was okay, but not great. And there was very little dynamic range in digital cameras at the time as well. So just a little, side photography history piece of that. So ISO being that focusing point of the quality of the image itself. And as a film shooter, you're going to have to be very aware of ISO, because one of the bummers is, unless you're shooting a medium format, you can't switch films, at least not easily. So with 35 millimeter, you've got either a 24 or 36 exposure roll. Well, what happens when you're shooting in great light and then suddenly clouds come over or it turns into nighttime and you haven't finished that roll of film yet? Well, back then it was no big deal. You just pulled the roll of film out anyway, threw it in your bag, and you just went, oh well. Well, with today's prices on film, that's probably not what you want to be doing because film's so expensive. So there were either two things you could do. Either have two of the same camera body, one loaded with 160 speed film, the other one 400 or whatever, and just juggle those two cameras based upon your lighting situation, which I'm sure no one's going to be doing that today unless they've got a lot of spare camera bodies laying around. But it's just something to keep in mind. It was done at the time. So with 35 millimeter, if you've loaded a roll of 400 speed film, you're going to be using that until you are out of that roll of film. While on a medium format camera like the Hasselblad, for example, that was a routine kind of switch because, like in this Hasselblad 500cm, the backs are interchangeable. So you would have a couple of these backs loaded with like 400 speed film. I'd have some backs loaded with 160 speed film. I had some loaded with 800 speed film. And I would swap the backs back and forth, based on what type of light I was going to be shooting in at the time. So that was always, something that was really advantageous about using the medium format cameras. And that was a, typical practice in the day. So with shutter speeds and using them to create or make something creative within your photograph, I really advise play around with it a little bit and see what works for you. One of the things I really enjoy doing with primarily with wedding photography or people photography, I really liked using black and white film and then dragging my shutter. In other words, shooting a slower shutter speed that would intentionally blur the photograph as a creative method. I was just inspired by some of the photos of the past and how in those days you had slow films. You only had maybe 50 ISO black and white film or 64 speed color film. And I was really inspired by the photographers of those eras who they didn't have a choice. They were in that kind of a light, they had that kind of a lens, and they shot it anyway, even though it was going to be blurry. And some of the feel that you get out of images like that, I always kind of enjoyed, just for the nostalgia of it. And so I started emulating that in my own work. One of the things I became known for was during the first dance or wedding dancing photos, I would drag my shutter and get some really cool results with, you know, light, like let's say when you had a DJ there and they had a lighting kit that would, you know, throw the little glowing balls all over the place, you know, not a disco ball, but a light projector. I would drag that shutter and those lights would streak and dance across the background and end up being really cool. And so I did that a lot in my film days in shooting, and in dragging the shutter, just creating some very interesting creative effects. In fact, let me pull up some examples of those so you can see how I use shutter speed with my photography. All right, so here's some examples of where you can use shutter speed to create kind of a creative, you know, addition to your photographic tool bag. So in this image here, this was used with a film camera. And so what I had done on this is, see these lights kind of cascading around the background. I dragged the shutter. So that way during the dip of the dance, those lights would cascade across the wall behind them, illuminate the image. And what kind of made it kind of neat is my buddy was in the background shooting as well from another angle, and just kind of created this really neat look for the image. But that's one example of dragging that shutter in that case. Now in some cases too, if you're doing, you know, fast moving subjects, I mean, you do want to stop action for the most part, but sometimes, you know, you want to use that motion to your advantage. And you're right, when you do stuff like this and you pan width, sometimes you're definitely going to lose sharpness, you're definitely going to lose detail, but you can gain an overall feeling of the image, which is kind of unique. And so like in this case here, with this horse running into the finish line, horse and rider, running into the finish line of a very, very long 100-mile endurance race. Here they are coming into the arena to the final stretch, and they're just taking kind of a victory lap, if you will. And you can tell it just turned out really neat. Yeah, it's not in focus, but you've got, you know, you can see the you know, the man smile very easily on the horse. It's kind of neat. Okay, another couple ones I like to use here. Same thing, just drag the shutter a little bit, create a little blur, but just has a nice feeling to it. And you're right, is it a you know, typically nice, sharp, in focus photo? Definitely not. It's not intended to be. You know, I definitely have shots of them in focus and sharp, but in this case, I wanted to create something a little bit different. And that gives you the opportunity, if you know how to use shutter speed properly, gives you the option to kind of choose and create and vary out, you know, branch out and try different things. Another one here. In this one, just really tight. Just come in real close, drag the shutter a little bit, and there you go. And usually when I do things like this, you notice, you know, 3 of these images are black and white. Yeah, I kind of like shooting that black and white, doing these in black and white. Well, the first one, that was shot in film. This one here and the last one, those were shot digitally. In fact, I think these were both shot with a Canon D60 back in the day. Anyway, just nice, something different. Well, this concludes the video on shutter speed. I hope this gives you some additional information and gives you some other creative tools in your photographic toolkit. So if you got any questions, please just enter in the comments below and I'll answer those back. And if you also are interested in my previous video, this is step 2 or video 2 of a series. I'll put a link to the first video up in the system, so that way you can go back and see it if you'd like. If this video was of value to you, please like it, hit subscribe. I really appreciate it. And thanks for participating, and thanks for being a part of the Photogs channel. Thanks. Bye.